friend and colleague here has the enviable task of he's monitoring the chat while he's also letting people in the waiting room. So he's kind of multitasking here right now. But, oh, Talia, you started the recording. Thank you. Okay. So, welcome everyone. Really good to see your faces and be with you. And Happy New Year. We're just talking a couple of minutes ago about our first meetup for the year, and wanted this to be a session of kind of taking stock, visioning for the year ahead. And if you haven't been here, these meetups, we've been holding these meetups for about a year and a half now. And these are monthly Zoom calls. This is a chance, I mean, quite selfishly, for me to get to meet and be interacting with those of you in the community, see your faces. It's really helpful for me to kind of touch the ground of the work. And it's also a chance for us to explore specific and particular topics around trauma-sensitive mindfulness. So some of you will be here, you've been with me for a while, maybe you've been through the course that we offer online, and others of you might be completely new. So wherever you're coming from, just welcome, really happy that you're here. And the topic for this particular meetup, as you would have seen in the email, is what's needed for the path ahead. I want to focus here on particular trauma-sensitive tools that can support us in our practice and our work in 2021. I just want to share the inspiration for this call. It actually came from I was having a late tea, social distance tea, with a friend of mine. Her name is Leslie McClure. And Leslie she is the science reporter for California for KQED, which is the NPR affiliate here. So it's the National Public Radio here. And so she's just been in with COVID the whole time. And she's been it's been powerful to hear her stories of she's really in talking to doctors and healthcare practitioners. She actually got a call while I was there from a doctor who was in LA. And the doctor actually just broke down in tears on this call and actually had just called Leslie to say, can I just talk to you about what's happening? And said that, and basically shared some of the intense adversity that's happening inside of hospitals right now. And the doctor said that one of the hardest things is that because cameras and video is not allowed, at least here in the US, in hospitals to take care of privacy, there's many ways that the public is not getting a kind of a visceral sense of what's actually happening in hospitals right now. And the doctor was saying, my staff, nurses, doctors, just all healthcare staff, are in the throes of PTSD, people dying, isolated, and said, we are stuck, we're trapped, we don't know what to do. We're trying to kind of wave a flag. So I was there for that call, and that was really powerful to just be reminded of what's happening in so many frontline working communities. And then I know a lot of you that are working with people who are frontline workers. And so we've heard from some of you about trying to get tools and ground. And here in the U.S., yesterday was the highest death count around COVID this whole time, and yet we have an intense political distraction at the moment as well. So given this particular moment, and given the fact that I think for many of us who are involved in meditation work on any level, it felt like, there's going to be many waves of complexity over this year to come in terms of how do we show up really effectively for the people that we are teaching, that we're serving, and also for ourselves. There are acute crises right now in the community, and then there's just going to be, it feels like, waves as we go forward. And I've been having some conversations with some of you about, again, what are the tools that we can have in our toolkit, and how do we want to orient to this particular moment around 2021? I was thinking also, for many of us, this may become a huge part of our mindfulness work and teaching for the next 12 months, maybe 5 years, or going forward. We will be encountering people who are experiencing trauma around the pandemic. So that's where I wanted to deepen here with you. And the question for this session is, what would we need to know, and what are the most important tools for this particular moment in 2021. And there's been times where I've talked about trauma sensitive mindfulness and I feel like it can feel a little theoretical. And this moment on this call with all of you seeing your faces, it feels like the rubber really hits the road. Like the stakes are very high about how we show up in offering contemplative body based practices to people who will have encountered trauma in so many different ways. And so I feel very motivated right now, and it's great to see your faces here and feel the presence of the community. So there's two main tools that I want to talk about today, and that is resourcing and pendulation. Resourcing, some of you will know from if you've gone through the course that we did. Resourcing is our ability to harness internal and external resources that can support the regulation of our nervous system. It's a huge part of trauma work. And there's a number of different tools, practices, and strategies that we can bring in. And so I'm going to talk about some of those today, and we're also going to be in some practice together. And the other is pendulation. And pendulation it's a competency, it's an ability to oscillate our attention between a stimuli that's more challenging and one that's more neutral or resourceful. And I think in this particular moment of so much sustained adversity, both resourcing and pendulation are for me, they're my go-to principles and practices inside of trauma sensitive mindfulness. So that's what we're going to cover today, and ultimately want to empower you in your own practice and then your teaching so you can be empowering others at the same time. In case this is your first meetup, just a reminder about the structure. So it's a 60-minute session here. We'll start with a brief practice as a way to ground. I'll speak for about 30, 35 minutes, and then we'll open it up to dialogue with all of you. At the very end of the call, if you want to hang on a little bit longer, we're going to do some optional breakout rooms. People stick around to meet each other and learn where people are coming from and working. We have rooms of 3 or 4. So if that's something you'd like to do, please hang out after the call. And just a few guidelines here. So see some of you on video. That's great. It's always, for those of us that can see, it's great to see your faces, and you're in choice, of course, around video. And in terms of the chat, how we work with this is I'll introduce Tyler in a second. We have the Zoom chat. Encourage you, as you did, sharing where you're from, questions that you're in. And as we go through, if you have questions about this particular topic or trauma sensitive mindfulness more generally, please chat them into the box. It's great. And Tyler will be monitoring it. And for the second half of the call, we will be opening it up, and Tyler will say, hey, there's a question here from fill in the blank. And we'll give you the invitation to come on, unmute yourself. If you don't want to be unmuted and stay off and be anonymous, that's also fine. So let me introduce Tyler really quickly. Tyler's here. He is a coach. He's trained in trauma sensitive mindfulness. He's also the person that if you're interfacing with us at all, he's probably he's the only person who would be answering the email. So Tyler, do you mind popping on, saying hi?
Yeah, hi all. Glad to be with you as always. As David said, feel free to put your questions in the chat box and I'll follow those. And glad to be supporting you here. And just a note also that I'll probably go off video at certain points, just because I'm like looking around the screen to make sure I'm getting all your questions and don't want to be distracting. So glad to be here, and thanks, David.
Yeah, thanks, Tyler. Just a note too, I'm not monitoring the chat because there's just too much happening. So if you're asking me a direct question, I won't see it, but Tyler will see it. So let's begin with a short practice just to support our presence, also our ground. So we'll be here for just a couple of minutes. I invite you to find a posture that will support you for this brief practice. And you can have your eyes open or closed. And as we begin, just taking a moment in whatever way makes sense for you to orient to the present time and space. It could be through the senses, like sounds, sight, sensations. Or it could also just be noticing that you've made the time to be here on this first meetup of the year, noticing what time of day it is. Or if you're watching the recording, just taking a moment to settle into the context of the moment, to help your nervous system land here, just here and now. And then invitation is to take a couple of deeper breaths. Yeah, slower inhale and a gentle exhale about the same pace. And inhale, filling to the top. And a gentle exhale. If the breath feels too activating, you can let that go. Otherwise, just a couple more breaths here to support some parasympathetic regulation, slowing down, letting ourselves really arrive here. And then just noticing what is here and present for you right now. It could be noticing your mood, for example, how you're coming into this session, maybe particular sensations that are present, that are informing what you know about your mood, or any narratives that are here right now. Just taking a moment to make space for what is here. You can label that if you like. And as much as possible, being with your experience in a non judgmental way. Being in some agreement with the experience, in both recognizing it and also allowing it to be here. And then for the final part of this practice, I want to invite you to make some form of physical contact with yourself. It could be through visualization, but it could also be through a hand on the heart. It could be just feeling the hands together in the lap, maybe the feet touching together. Or one I've been working with recently is just a hand on the back of the neck, making contact, physical contact with the bottom of the brain stem, communicating a sense of presence, ground, and really just unconditional support. And with that touch, wherever you're making contact, just seeing if you can extend some care and some presence. Noticing if there's anything that you need to hear that would support you to be as present as possible in the session conversation. And then in the next few breaths, you can let that contact go. And just finishing here with a couple deeper breaths. Coming back into this particular moment, knowing that we're ending this meditation, but you can always come back here during the call at any moment. Okay, thanks everyone. So, as I mentioned, the title here of this meetup is What's Needed? What's needed for this moment and for the path ahead? And as a way to intro this topic, specifically around resourcing and pendulation, I just want to speak to a core tenet of trauma sensitive mindfulness work, which some of you will know. But that is that more is not always better when it comes to meditation and trauma, and specifically around attention inside of trauma, that we need to be very nuanced in our understanding of the power of meditation and attention when we're offering it to people who are struggling with trauma. Trauma really pushes back on the idea that meditation is just some kind of innocuous practice for stress reduction. And one of the main reasons that this is the case is that we will generally tend to reflexively orient to what's threatening, both inside and outside of our experience. And what many therapeutic approaches around trauma have flagged and noticed, which is really my inroad into this whole topic, was that if you have someone who is struggling with trauma, pay close, sustained attention to something that's a stimuli that is connected to a trauma, that they can become overwhelmed. That can be too much too soon. And that we're not asking people to go directly into connecting with their flashbacks or sensations. Inside of meditation, this creates a certain setup where we are asking people to attend to their inner world. And in all likelihood, they will encounter trauma. They'll bump into something connected to traumatic stress. Now, that's not automatically a bad thing inside of meditation, but at the very least, it creates a higher degree of difficulty for people who are practicing. So I think back to this doctor who called my friend, and I was imagining, say she didn't meditate, that wasn't a part of her practice, but was saying, hey, I need some ground, I need some resource, and that she started to practice in the midst, either in the midst of this experience right now with the global pandemic, or even in the aftermath, say 6, 12 months, or at any point where ideally, I hope, things start to become, there's a little bit more space inside of uh, a medical system. In all likelihood, this doctor will be encountering some aspects of the adversity and trauma that she's been experiencing, whether that's memories, flashbacks, sensations, the hyperarousal of needing to be so vigilant for so long. And the whole point of the work that we're doing here around trauma sensitive mindfulness is to equip you to be able to catch and support people who are likely experiencing some kind of symptoms of traumatic stress in their practice. It's not to say, I'm here to identify and recognize trauma, and therefore you shouldn't be practicing any kind of internal awareness. On the contrary, it's to say there are so many communities that could benefit from contemplative and body-based practice going forward, and they will likely need some very particular tools and resources as they're in their practice to access the power of practice. So that's what we're up to here. And then I want to take that and then focus specifically on COVID-19. That's what I've been reflecting on. So, as you all know, we are in a massive moment, a massive global challenge where rates of depression, anxiety, and also suicide are up. We have intense social isolation, and we also have intense loss that's happening inside of social isolation. Many people in communities are experiencing an increased exposure to trauma and adversity more generally. We also have the fact that the global pandemic has been so sustained. I mean, we've been doing these meetups now for a long time. And, it's now been basically a whole year, close to a year of being in conversation about, like, hey, let's come at COVID-19 from this angle or from this angle. How can we work through it? And it's just been so sustained. And so part of what I'm hearing from many different communities is now there's the traumatic impacts of this sustained adversity over time. So why does that matter for us here? Well, in my trauma training, sustained trauma over time was often more difficult to integrate than a singular acute form of trauma, such as a car accident, for example. Now, that's not always going to be the case. But when we're starting to work with these multi layered traumas that have happened over time, it becomes quite challenging to untangle. Yeah. The nervous system that has been in so many layers of override, of survival based responses to stress and adversity, it's not easy to actually work through. So that is the context I want to enter into here of talking about the tools. We have this overall setup that I just described around meditation happening during a time where trauma is really widespread. And the question I always keep coming back to with you all is, okay, well, what do we need to know? What do we need to know? If you're totally new to this topic and you want a little bit more ground into the why of meditation and trauma, we have there's a free webinar that we just put up a couple months ago. So that's there for you if you want to go deeper. But I want to go into some tools here, and that is the resourcing and pendulation. And we'll talk about them. We'll be in some practice, and then we'll open it up. And of course, again, if there's questions that are coming in or comments, please include them in the chat. So let me start with resourcing. I'll spend about 5 minutes on each, and then we'll shift. So resourcing, as I mentioned, involves purposefully attending to something that brings us a sense of regulation and ease. And for myself included, I've had a rough rough stretch. And resourcing doesn't always mean connecting with joy and happiness. Sometimes it's just finding something neutral. If everything's feeling difficult, it's like, can we find one sensation or one external stimuli that gives us a little bit of ground? Resourcing, if it's new to you, can seem counterintuitive, where when we'll offer it to, say, a client or group, and it can feel a little bit like, why, yeah, but the challenges with trauma, why would I pay attention to what brings a sense of ease? I've actually need to be with what's difficult. But many trauma approaches suggest that actually our ability to be present with what is resourceful actually supports our ability to integrate what is traumatic. So that's what we can be up to. One quick frame here is, some of you know the psychologist Rick Hansen. Rick Hansen has a distinction between what he calls working with and being with. And with being with, this is largely the competency we develop with meditation. We're guiding people, or we're in the practice of just being with our experience, which is so important. And at the same time, we also need to have tools to work with our experience. Maybe that involves taking a walk, or we're doing a different practice than just a bare being with practice. Resourcing, as we're going to be talking about here, is more of a working with practice. Yeah, where we're actively helping people to kind of actively shape their experience. But what I want to be very, very clear about with resourcing is this is not the practice of avoidance. We're not just encouraging people when things get difficult to actually, turn their attention away. But what I think we are saying with resourcing is, if things get to a point of overwhelm, shifting attention to a resource can actually support you to come back to the practice of being with. And I think in 2021, resourcing is going to be a central tenet and practice of trauma sensitive mindfulness. People need to know that there can be moments when we back off and do something different, again, in the service of being with. So I'd like to offer a brief practice here. And so you can come back into any kind of posture that will support you, but we'll just be here for a minute or two. We can come at resourcing in so many different ways, but I'll offer you one way that I will introduce it to clients or meditation students. And that is to just take a moment here, again, with your eyes open or closed, whatever you prefer. Just taking a moment to take stock here, maybe with a couple of breaths. Just noticing the state of affairs. Again, could be reconnecting with sensations in the body, your mood, or noticing the quality of thoughts or narratives that are here. And noticing where your attention goes in this moment, and just allowing whatever is here to be present as much as possible. And then the invitation here is to purposefully direct your experience to an internal or external stimuli that feels resourceful for you. And by resourceful, I mean something that brings a sense of ground, perhaps ease, and a sense of well being. So, internally, that could be scanning for sensations or the absence of sensations that provide a sense of ground. Maybe the feeling of the feet on the ground, or even it could be as small as a feeling of neutrality in the hand or the forearm. If you're in a lot of pain right now, emotional or physical, it may be just seeing if there's a place where you're not in pain. You might also direct your attention externally. Sometimes it's easier to find resources outside of us. That could be something in the environment, like a tree, a plant, the quality of light on a piece of furniture, a sound that you find grounding, whatever that is for you. If no resources come to you, that's fine. This can be an ongoing practice. Otherwise, just letting your attention purposely rest with this resource, letting this be a place to anchor your attention for the next few breaths. And just noticing what it's like for you to be connected to and present with this resource. Does it change your breath, your mood? No expectation of what will happen here, just noticing what happens with this resource. And then in the next few breaths, we will be shifting away from this resource, though you're welcome, of course, to stay tethered to it. But just letting yourself know we'll be shifting here. Maybe ending with a deeper breath. And we're coming back here. Okay. So that's resourcing. Again, not avoidance. I will, when I introduce resourcing to other people, I will be very transparent about that. I will say, I'm not offering you this practice to try to escape difficulty. This is actually a practice to build your capacity to be with difficulty. And sometimes this is the most skillful and compassionate move that we can make with ourselves or with a group that we're working with. So that is resourcing. We will return to it in a moment. And again, happy to talk more about if you have questions specifically around resourcing. But let me move to the second skill practice that I want to bring in for 2021, and that's pendulation. And pendulation is a key concept inside of somatic experiencing, which some of you will know. It's Dr. Peter Levine, who created this approach. It's a psychotherapeutic approach to trauma recovery. And to pendulate, then you know this what is it called? I've suddenly forgotten the name. Oh, metronome. Yeah, that when you're playing for an instrument, kind of going back and forth. And to pendulate literally means to sway to and fro. I actually looked up the definition last night, or to oscillate. And if you remember what I said earlier, because of this tendency to reflexively orient to traumatic stimuli, learning to direct attention away from what is traumatic and what is overwhelming can be very important for someone who's practicing meditation. And I gotta say, the concept of pendulation is it sounds simple, but it's much easier said than done. So I want you to imagine this. Imagine, or you might have had this experience, if you are attending to something traumatic that feels relevant for your safety, asking someone to simply pay attention elsewhere is a really big ask. So I'll just say in my own trauma work, when I was, you know, doing the biggest parts of my own trauma healing, when someone I was working with said, "Well, I want you to see if you can take your attention off of the flashbacks or the sensations in your stomach, and I want you to see if you can come back to your feet on the ground of a tree outside." My whole nervous system would be like, "What are you talking about? Why on earth would I pay attention to something different than what seems intimately connected to my survival?" So that moment, that like separation of attention from the traumatic stimuli is huge for people. And if they can learn it, it can open up space for so much freedom. And mindfulness and meditation can be so powerful. I think it's the most effective and powerful practice to be able to just get a little bit of distance from being identified and kind of merged with a traumatic stimuli. So when it comes to pendulation inside of meditation and mindfulness, it really involves shifting attention from one stimuli, we could say, to something more resourceful. Yeah. That we're actually pendulating and moving away from something that feels challenging and overwhelming. But we can also come back to what is challenging as a way to support integration. I think of it a little bit like two two drinks being mixed together, and this slow pendulation and oscillation between the two, which can actually create a lot of integration and support. So that's a lot of words talking about pendulation. So why don't we actually practice it? So I'm going to invite you back into uh, a similar space that you were in before, where you were just practicing resourcing. And in this opening part of the practice, I'm going to be inviting you to connect with something that is slightly challenging or perturbing for you. It may be that there's nothing here right now that's perturbing, or that you don't want to go into anything challenging, and that's fine. Otherwise, just gently scanning the body right now and noticing if there's any points of sensations or if there's any situations in your life right now that are calling for your attention, that are challenging, and ideally choosing something on the lower end of intensity here, like a 2 out of 10 in terms of intensity if possible. But you're in choice here. And just for a moment, being present with this perturbation or challenge, noticing how it's arising in this moment. Yeah, as much as possible, non judgmentally, just being with this challenge, allowing it to be there. And then in your own time, in the next breath or two, the invitation is to direct your attention towards the resource that you were working with before. So gently, with respect and care, but also intentionality, seeing what happens if you direct your attention to the resource you were working before, or it could be another resource if you choose. And just noticing how easy or difficult that is. Again, we're not avoiding here. It's to build a little bit of strength and resilience back into the system. Being present with this resource for another few breaths here. And then the final invitation for this practice is to let your attention go back towards the challenge and then towards the resource for one more round here. So, if you like, directing your attention back to that initial challenge, almost like letting two containers mix here. Seeing what's here now in this moment around the challenge. Just noticing what's here. And then, if you like, in your own time, directing the attention again back to the resource, pendulating the attention purposefully towards what brings a sense of ground without expectation of what will happen, just being in the experiment. And then in the next few breaths, we will shift out of this practice. Go in any way that you'd like to end here with a couple deeper breaths, making some physical contact, but just letting yourself register that we'll be shifting here. And if you like taking any notes or if there's any questions or comments, please including them in the chat here. So that is what I wanted to cover today around this topic of potential tools for 2021. Of course, this is going to continue around what are the tools that we need. But these are the two main ones for me around the intense activation that will be like we are encountering now and will be encountering going forward. These two tools of resourcing and pendulation being central inside of trauma sensitive mindfulness. So I'm going to shift here for a moment to open it up. Imagine some of you who've been in the chat. Just as we shift here, as we'll open up, I want to show you the resource. This is my external resource. I just put it on social media. I showed some of you before. This is George the Sloth. I had a friend give me this, and I've had a couple moments the last couple of weeks where I've just been like, I can't be present with me, but I hang him up at my desk, and he's just this. He's always smiling, and I've needed to have an external resource, and he's just been a reminder, like slow down, very slothy, take a breath. So resources can also be external for us as well. Just want to remind us that. Okay, enough talking. Tyler, has there been anything in the chat?
Yeah,
Someone
absolutely.
someone else has a sloth? I just saw a chat here. I just opened up. Someone else has a sloth here. All
So
right,
good.
what we got? How's it going?
Catherine, great sloth. Yeah, there's some great questions coming in. Thanks and folks sharing some of their resources. Thanks.
Oh, great. Yeah, that's awesome. Please do.
Yeah. And one question I thought to maybe bring in Victoria Lopez. If you had a question around pendulation and dissociation, if you're up for taking yourself off mute and asking a question.
Sure. Thank you. Hi.
Hey.
Thank you so much, David, for this. I was just curious how you ensure that pendulation doesn't move into disassociation. And as you were going through I asked the question prior to you doing the exercise, and going through the exercise, I could see where that the pendulating from the resourceful state back. But just curious if you could speak to that, just because I could see that could potentially slip into a disassociative state.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, especially if, or do you work with people who, is dissociation kind of part of your work as well?
No, I'm familiar with it. I'm
Yeah.
mindfulness and coaching, but absolutely very aware, and have done a lot of personal research around it just to be able to work well with that.
It's such a great question. So for those, if dissociation is newer for folks here, that's a disconnection from our physical and emotional experience. And we all dissociate to some degree, you ever had the experience where maybe you're driving or heading somewhere and you're like, wow, I don't remember that experience at all. Like there's a whole spectrum of dissociation. There's actually a great book called I think it's trauma related dissociation. So there are people that have done deep work into what is really a survival strategy of being able to disconnect or dissociate from that is what is too much for us to bear. I think it's Peter Levine talked about dissociation as our ability to get away when we can't get away. So it's a bit of it's a superpower. And dissociation comes up a lot in trauma sensitive mindfulness because how do we know the difference between when we're dissociating, like when we're kind of foggy, disconnected, we're not feeling ourselves, and say intense concentration and meditation? It's difficult to tease it out. And then to your point, such a great point, is that when we're asking someone to pendulate, if they tend to dissociate, if that's a survival strategy for them, it's kind of like they go whew, and they're off, and it's difficult to come back. So I think two things here. One, no, be tracking for whether that's happening for someone. So signs of dissociation are someone suddenly becomes kind of foggy in their cognitive processing, or when you're with people and there's that kind of 1,000-yard stare, like they're there but they're not really there. So we have ways of detecting and learning that someone might be dissociating. So you can learn that, track for it when you're offering these practices. But specifically to your point, I found it most important that someone has a place to land inside of their resourcing instead of just pendulating away from what's difficult. So if I'm asking someone to move from a traumatic stimuli over to something else, I want to give them a kind of a lily pad or a place that they can move over to. So that's why I started here with resourcing, is giving you a chance to kind of ground in the body around resourcing, and then noticing, can you land back in the resourcing as opposed to kind of slipping off of it and ending up in more dissociation. So those are two ways that I work with it, giving people kind of a target, and then just tracking that what you said, it's possible people can pendulate into dissociation, and that can be unhelpful. And sometimes people will need one-to-one work around that. If someone's constantly dissociating in meditation, they might need a one-to-one practitioner. So what do you think of that? Does that answer your question, or what would you add to that?
Yes, absolutely. And as I was doing the practice, I realized, just as you said, I love that idea of having a lily pad, having a place to land in the resourceful state. And that would be the thread to kind of that lifeline, not lifeline, but So and what's helpful as well is just watching for the signs,
Totally.
because
Totally.
it's a possibility, of course. And so it's a great resource and exercise, but just being able to be aware if they just don't have the capacity at this time to be able to
Yeah,
do that, and be able to give them the resources to work with that. So,
totally.
yeah,
Totally.
thank you.
Yeah, no, thanks for the question. And also, as you're saying, I think having deep respect for dissociation as a strategy, that we're not shaming someone. People, I find they can feel like, damn it, I went away. And as a coach or a meditation teacher, I'm trying to bring an attitude of, that's awesome that you noticed that you went away. Did you notice where you went? So mindfulness, I think, can be actually hugely helpful around association because it gives people that ability to notice that they went away. In that book around trauma related association, they talk about mindfulness being a kind of a core practice for people to gain that ground. So thank you so much. That's such a great inquiry. Tyler.
Yeah, thanks for that question. Um, yeah, I wanted to maybe keep rolling with the questions here around the practices. Betsy Fagan, if you're here, you had a question around languaging. I'm wondering if you would be willing to come on and ask your question.
Sure. The
Hey.
question was just, it was literally just around the languaging. It was in both of the practices, there were words about without expectation. And it seemed like there's very much an expectation that identifying with this resource is going to provide some kind of calm or benefit. Is there
Yeah.
some way to say that? I mean, it just sounds like it's disingenuous, and I'm wondering how else can you frame it? Because there is an expectation in the practice, and
Yeah. I hear you. I'm actually open to suggestions from you around this, because it's true. I'm trying to bake in that possibility. I mean, I appreciate the feedback in some ways about if it feels disingenuous. I guess I've worked with a couple people. It's usually a smaller percentage, but people, when bringing in resourcing, the feeling of like, I cannot connect with a resource can produce a bit of shame. And that sense of like, God damn it, I can't even, here I am trying to feel neutral or somewhat positive, but even this isn't working. F you. It's just a lot of frustration. And when I'm offering resourcing, if I don't have room inside me for someone's anger and frustration about how difficult it is sometimes to connect with resources, or like one isn't available, then the whole thing can feel like a bit of an override, I think, where it seems like blowing sunshine in some ways. And which, if we extend that to larger social conditions, can just sound like, well, don't, let's not be with oppression and trauma. Let's actually just all do this practice to feel better. And I want to make sure someone's hearing that's not at all the intention. So uh, I'd say it's whatever works for you. Maybe it's just even the embodiment of saying, whatever happens here is really okay. It's like if you come to me and say, I can't find one and I hate this practice, that I'm making some room for that, as opposed to just having the assumption this is going to be easy and make you feel quote unquote better when you get there. I'm trying to make it an experiment. So I'll say, it's the one thing I'll say. I do try to set this up as experimental as possible. Like, we're going to try this. Here's the intentionality behind it, but let's see what happens. So that's my take. But how would you do it, Betsy, or what, in terms of who you work with?
I'm here to learn.
Yeah,
And
yeah,
I
right,
wanted to
yeah.
kind of like bring in Patrice's comment as well, because there is this,
I don't know if I saw Patrice's comment.
maybe Patrice can jump on, but just there's just so much happening, and I don't want to ever set it up in that way, like you said, that there's an expectation,
Yeah,
because there's so much trauma and so much anxiety that it's entirely possible that there isn't resource, and
right,
I
right.
don't know how to talk about it best.
Well, one way that it's just true, there's just truth in what you're saying. And then how do we to be with, if someone's like, I can't connect with a resource, then just to be okay with that. That's something I need to work with, as opposed to like, oh, the feeling of failure. But this gets back to the neutrality piece, where I know for many, myself included, it may not be about what feels grounding and resourceful. It may actually just be about, is there any places where there isn't pain? That's the inquiry there. And again, that won't always, people are like, I can't not find it. But in my experience, usually people, even if it's just a pinky, they'll just be like, okay, there is a place where I'm not experiencing that level of pain. Let's start there. And so maybe that's another way to, again, build in the kind of an on ramp into it without setting up an expectation of like failure. I really appreciate the question. Sorry, you had asked someone to come on, a comment.
Um, Patrice.
Patrice, you here?
Yeah. Hi.
Hey, Patrice. Do
Hey.
you want to say whatever you said in the, thanks, Betsy.
Yeah, I put it back in the chat. No, I said it. Yeah, so there it is. Like the ongoing trauma of being in a Black body. You were talking about this, 10 and more plus months as ongoing, as opposed to contrast as something that's acute and that it's harder to integrate. And
Right.
my comment was that, it stands for what and there's been some greater, in some instances, recognition. But even like the sense of, oh my God, the places where I see racism as a little t trauma.
Right. 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 Yeah. Yeah.
And so a sense of, and it's also traumatizing when the experience is invalidated.
Yes.
It's like,
100%.
it's like,
Yeah. Yeah.
yeah. And so to be going through, even with what happened at the Capitol, where I've been in sanghas where, in BIPOC sanghas where I'm not sure I still can be with what happened for being with what didn't happen.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
one of the things I realized, it took several days, and I have a very good, very clear since September 11th, very clear boundaries around watching news as opposed to reading
Yeah.
without the audio vision. Yeah.
Yeah.
Um, how so much of what was coming up in my body, and then this comparison to it would have, how it would have been. And I was like,
Yeah.
oh, it was like Friday evening in Sangha when I finally was like, yeah, I'm not disputing what you're thinking, but it's not happening right now.
Yeah.
Like the sense of like,
Yeah. A couple, can I jump in, Betsy? Thanks for what you're sharing. And thanks. Yeah. Patrice, I'm sorry. It just two things come up, and you and we've had conversation different times. I really appreciate what you're saying about sometimes the absence of what's happening is also can be traumatic, like the absence of protection in a family or by community or state, that can also have traumatic impacts over time. And Patrice, I hear that's something that you're working with. I mean, all of us should be, of seeing what's absent. And I'll just share one other thing, and then I'll put it back to you. The people, the practitioners that I look up to the most, they, when they're talking about trauma and oppression, they really are, they always talk beyond their lifetime. There's no sense of there's a getting over. I mean, I know I said this about the next year around maybe COVID shifts, but when it comes to racism, systems of oppression, and the traumatic impacts of those, that there's this all stretches for me, at least beyond my lifetime. Do all the work I can to heal and shift systems, and yet there's no feeling of like somehow this will end, because there's just such a big tail behind here. So those are the people that I look to. That's what they embody, is there's a long view. You're someone who I look to here as just someone who has a very long view, multi-generational, around healing, and it's not just about feeling better in the moment. So anyway, I appreciate you bringing in the long view. Anything you want to share before?
well, yeah, when I said what didn't happen last week at the Capitol, I wasn't, this, there was a participant who got maced or pepper sprayed and had this outrage, and said, just said the difference in the police, who they're supposed to be for and who they're supposed to be against, and she just articulated it directly. So when I was talking about what didn't happen, I'm saying if the bodies that tried to get in were brown and black, they wouldn't have gotten in. They would have been met in body armor. There would have been blah 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 blah. And so the sense of like,
All right, give me.
how did you let this happen?
Oh, all right.
Hey, Patrice, you got muted
Oh,
just
I'm
for a sec.
talking and I just saw the thing that said, please unmute yourself. Oh my goodness.
No. We heard you. It was just for a sec. It was just for a sec,
Oh,
Patrice. Yeah.
okay. Yeah, that's when I said what didn't happen last week. I meant what didn't happen to the people because they were white,
I see what you're saying.
and what that does
Yeah.
to the sense of
Yeah.
individual and communal
Yeah.
hurt
Yeah.
and rage.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
Thank you, Patrice. Yeah. That was really stark. That was such a stark example of how race plays out here in the US. Patrice will be around. I'm around after if you want to continue conversation. Yeah. Thanks for what you brought in. We have a couple more minutes. I want to, this isn't to move on. It's actually to say, okay, how can we iteratively keep building here? So Tyler, I'm just wondering if there's, and Patrice, there's some love coming for you here in the chat. Tyler, is there any other questions that I
Yeah,
want to bring in here?
yeah, thanks. And yeah, thanks, Patrice. Appreciate your coming in there. And yeah, lots of appreciation for you in the chat. And this question was not directly related, but I think it is certainly related. Here, Emma McBride, if you're her, you had a question around you noticing that some folks having trouble contextualizing the collective experiences that we're having right now versus things that are you put it quote that the trauma they already know versus maybe the broader unrest. Are you willing to come on and ask your question around
Sure.
that?
Yeah, and I agree, Patrice, what you just shared, I think helped contextualize the question that I was asking a little bit for me. I think when I use the word contextual, I'm using it in the way Resma Menachem does, where I sense in my clients sometimes, especially my clients who are already in therapy for acute or developmental trauma that they're used to working with in their lives, that they might come to session and identify what they're experiencing with the trauma that they have been working with for many years, rather than um, identifying with the trauma that might be a little bit under the line or that might be more collective, less clearly contextualized right now. So I was thinking of an example, a client that I saw yesterday who was feeling some mood lability and malaise and identified this as related to some trauma with her romantic relationship. And it was only as the session went on that she started to more fully articulate how she was holding this past week, the assault in the Capitol in her body, and then also this past year or several years. So I think I wanted to know what your thoughts are on how we can help folks use practice to come into that sense of collective unrest that's sometimes a little bit harder for us to be tangible with,
Mm-hmm,
to
mm-hmm.
name.
Yeah, I love the inquiry. I mean, mostly I'm with you in it around the inquiry of the ways that the dangers of trauma being individualized. And at least that's how I was as a clinician. Most of the education I had was to think about trauma as an individual tragedy, as opposed to something that can be rooted in something more collective. So I feel like there's I don't know if you experienced this, but I feel like there's a current that will tend to pull towards an individualization. And I think of trauma sensitive practice, inside the frame here, Betsy, Patrice, and what's come up is that there needs to be, that to me is a commitment that can be made inside a trauma sensitive practice to push against that current that will individualize, because it leaves people, any of us, highly isolated and disconnected from, as you're saying, like the actual social pressures that are impinging, and the ways that people can end up just isolated and shame. Like, I guess it's my fault. And I've seen this happen in a lot of meditation groups where someone's in a really individual inquiry about their trauma. And then someone comes in and goes, well, how about, for example, the Capitol? Or how about this event and the ways that this might be impacting you? And someone goes, wow, I hadn't even noticed. So I think my answer to where I'm at these days is, how can any of us as practitioners or wherever we are in our lives be able to make connections explicitly between personal and social systems? And then when we offer that to people, it's a bit of inquiry. It's not coming in and saying, well, this is probably because of this, but actually inviting, like, well, what do you think of ways that, this rung or this system could be impacting right now? Not as an explanation, but more as an invitation, and getting away the pain of people just individualizing, like, oh, it must be because you can't be more mindful, can run into a lot of trouble. So that's my thought. And then I'm with you in it. Anything that you'd want to add here?
No, that was very helpful. I particularly like the note about just offering language around a collective trauma frame, but not necessarily imposing it. It's like we're offering the narrative as possible. And
Yes.
then whether or not it's functional for that individual in that moment is a process of inquiry that we're in together.
Totally. And I encourage the person to use mindfulness to check it out, like really notice about the impact. I'll just tell one 30-second story. I was in a multiracial space where the people were doing it was a meditation retreat, doing some work around racial justice. And there was a person in the space who is one of the few folks of color in the space who was in an inquiry around vigilance. And they were really in an individual inquiry about the relationship between their vigilance and their meditation practice. And it was another teacher, a person of color in the space, who said, could it also be that you're one of the few folks of color here in a predominantly white space, and the impact of that on your vigilance? And that was, for this person, like, oh, right, thank you for reminding, yeah, get a little bit wider. And it really supported their practice. So I think that's the live ongoing conversation, and to be continued, onward. So thanks, Emma. Thanks for your work. Wow. So we're at 10. That happened quickly. Tyler, just because I haven't watched the chat, is there anything you want to say before we shift and close here?
Just thanks y'all for your questions. So many good questions, really rich. And sorry we didn't get to all of them, but please come join us again. And yeah, thanks for all your energy and what you're all bringing.
Totally. Yeah. Thank you so much for being here, everyone. It's always amazing to go back through the chat after, and I'm like, oh, we didn't get to that. And so thanks for your presence. And we will be shifting here and then closing before going to breakout rooms. So if you have a minute here, I realize we're at the top of the hour, but if you have 30 seconds to just finish and practice with us here, just invite you to take a moment and just to take a few deeper breaths as a way to just integrate and support whatever's here. Yeah, this whole path to me, it's an iterative process. So just noticing what's here for you right now. Any moods, emotions, thoughts, and questions. Making space for that. And then just purposefully acknowledging that we'll be shifting here. So the pause, taking a pause together before you shift into whatever's next in your day. So we will be back next month. Maybe we'll do a part 2 of this, or we'll see what happens next couple of weeks. I mentioned the webinar. If you'd like to, it's up free on the website. If you'd like to check it out, we'll have some new podcast episodes, and we'll just keep you posted on articles. And I'm trying to get more into social media. I'm not so great at it, but I'm trying my best to be on that thread too. So thanks, everyone. If you have resources that you want us to know about or shared, please email us. Tyler will be right there. And we will shift to the breakout rooms if you want to hang around. Otherwise, just invite you to, we can unmute ourselves and we can say goodbye so we can hear people's voices as we go.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Bye. Thanks so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you.
Bye.
Take care.